Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in round number 5 of the 2020 Candidates Tournament. Winner of this tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen at the end of the year for the World Championship. And today we have two players tied at the top of the tournament. White's going to be played by Nepomniachtchi. This is the player who I called as the dark horse to win the tournament, the favorite I think, not necessarily the player I'm cheering for. That would be Fabiano Caruana, but his opponent, and that is Wong. He is not near the top from a rating standpoint, but having a phenomenal tournament and is tied with Jan at the top as far as points. So this is a very, very important game for both players as they get into round number 6 right before the second break. They play 3 days in a row and then take a day off. So Jan starts out with e4. And then after e5, knight f3, knight f6, getting into the Petrov defense. Knight takes here on e5, d6. These are all the main lines. After e4, then we see d4, d5 here, solidifying this outpost for the knight here on e4. And then bishop to d3. All the main lines in the Petrov defense. Have a video on the Petrov defense and some lines if you're not familiar with this opening. Definitely some interesting lines you can go down, but the main line pretty straightforward as far as how both sides continue. Putting a lot of pressure on this e4 square. It's very vital for both sides to control that. We see castle on the king side, bishop to e7, preparing to castle on the king side for black as well. Rook to e1. Now we have the bishop and the rook here attacking the square, and the bishop and the pawn defending that in the center of the board. Castle on the king side, and then knight to d2, attacking this knight. Knight comes back here to d6. Does not like the option of coming down and taking here on d2, and I would agree that it's probably not the best setup. If you look at it on the board, bishop takes here on f5. Now the knight's going to come back here to c4. Not nearly as good as if it's here on e4. It's still an outpost here, but just not doing too much. White could even come up and exchange the knights on board, but if you look at this, White just has a much more active position, has a very, very aggressive square here on e5. It's already defended by the rook back here. Has a very active light square bishop. Definitely a pretty good setup for White. You can see why Black may not be looking to go ahead and exchange that material right away. So brings the knight back here to d6. Now, since that knight's not really needed here on d2, and it is also blocking the dark square bishop, decides to come back here to f1. Later on, if it wants to come to e3 or g3, does have that option. Now we see Black decide to go ahead and take the bishop here on d3. We see the exchange. Definitely don't want to recapture and have double pawns here on the d file for no reason. So it takes with the queen here, pawn to c6, solidifying this pawn chain. Also means that you're probably going to see the knight coming here to either d7 or could also come to a6 and then could either swing down here to b4. Or could also come to a6, swing back here to c7, and then see what options they have from there. Bishop to f4, just developing that dark square bishop, also opening up for this other rook to get involved into the action here, putting some pressure on these dark squares in the center of the board. Knight to a6 is the option that Wong decides to go with, and then h4 over here. White has a very active position here. Decides to start pushing on the king side of the board. Knight to c7, knight up here to a g5. So it's got the little outpost here. Bishop and queen are both attacking the square, but the bishop and the pawn here are defending that nicely. Bishop takes, and the bishop recaptures here. Want to make sure that you take back with the right material. It would definitely be a mistake to take with the pawn right here, mostly because knight to e6 is pretty difficult to deal with. Attacking both the bishop and the pawn right here. If the bishop can't do too much here, it could just retreat, which you don't want to have your bishop move back. You want to have this pretty aggressive here. And you have both the knight and the queen attacking this, so it's going to be very difficult to hold on to this material. So could decide in this case to go ahead and take this material. But then after the queen takes here, the knight's still attacking this. You're really going to have to either push pawns forward more than you would like to, get your queen into a position you may not like it as well. All in all, definitely not the position that white wants. Much better position to go ahead and take with the bishop. Now the knight's still over here on c7. It's not as active. The queen's not going to be moving anytime soon, so white definitely has the upper hand compared to if he decided to take with his pawn here on g5. Now pawn f6. Threatening the bishop. The bishop's forced to move. Once it does do this, this does weaken the king side a little bit. It's a little bit better knowing that there's not the light square bishop can attack. Obviously, the queen is on the board, so the queen can at some points get to these light squares. Eventually, black's going to want to bring his king over here to h8. Just get a little bit more protection here on the king side. Queen to d7, it is being blocked by the pawn here on f6, so trying to find ways to get the queen involved into the game, also opening up the door for this other rook to get involved as well. Chess is all about getting your pieces involved into the game, trying to maximize the amount of squares that they can really go to on the board. Queens obviously want to have the most squares they can get to at all times, and you want to connect your rooks on the back line. So that's why you're seeing some of these moves for those newer players checking out the Candidates Tournament. Try to explain some of the opening moves, the development moves that you'll see from both sides. Knight to g3. About time that we get this knight involved in the game. Wasn't doing too much here on the f1 square. Rook to e8. And then we see the bishop take here on d6. We do see the exchange. Now knight up here to f5. Part of the reason that the bishop decided to take here on d6 is you gain this one little tempo, meaning your knight comes up here to f5 and you essentially force the queen to move. Queen comes back here to d7. Queen over here to h3. You do have a nice defense on this knight and also threatening something like knight to h6. Obviously, black's not going to fall for this. You may see something, a weaker player, maybe club level or below, fall for something like this. This would be a discovered attack on the queen. Check with your knight right here, and then the queen would fall. But we see king to h8. Black's definitely not going to fall for that. And then white decides to start pushing forward on the king side of the board here with h5. Rook takes on e1. We do see an exchange right here. Rook to e8. And then these come off the board. So both sides equal in material getting into the endgame. Not clear how either side is going to win. But if anything, white definitely has a more aggressive setup here. His knight's in the center of the board. It's already on f5 right here. The knight back here for black is on the e8 square. So it's going to take some time to get involved into the game. As far as the queens, white's a little bit more active. The kings are both pretty safe right here. But truly, I don't see a path very clearly for either side to go ahead and win from here. Jan continues with g4, says, if there's anything, I'm going to try to find it. Starts pushing on the king side of the board. With the king side pretty much spoken for with the knight, the queen, and all these pawns, we see how Wang decides to start pushing on the queen side of the board. b3 from white, queen to e6, just centralizing that queen a little bit more. Knight back here to e3. Just stopping the queen threat from coming down here to e1, starting to check the opponent. Maybe get behind enemy line, start to attack these pawns over here on the queen side of the board. Knight to d6, definitely want to get that knight involved into the game. h6 here, we do see g6, just stopping that threat on the king side of the board. c4, we do see the exchange right here, king to g8. Queen down here to h2 just says, yeah, if you want to take material, I'm going to swing my queen up here and start to attack. We see the king to f7, now pawn to c5. This says, yeah, you can't take my pawn right here because I can't swing up here and check your king and take some material here. So it has a nice solid pawn chain. Decides to bring his knight over here to b5. Now queen to b8. And this is a tricky spot. Finding where black should go to in this position is not easy. I think if most people analyze this position for a while, they would figure out just how tricky this is from black. If we look at some of the options here, one would be the queen takes here on a2. Now this would be the worst option, but it may just on the surface look like a decent option to go ahead and start taking material here. You threaten your opponents. Now you have your queen back. You can always start checking your opponents, but that's going to lose. Queen takes on b7 check. Then you're going to have, depending on where the king goes to, You have queen to c6, taking material, check. King over here to d8. Queen takes on f6, just gobbling up material here and checking at the same time here. Queen takes on h7. All of a sudden you see all this material coming off the board here. Now, there's now a passed pawn on the h file, which is going to be very dangerous for black to have to deal with. You have these two pawns in the center. How does black really continue? I could try to check your opponent, that's fine, but then it doesn't take too long for black to run out of moves to continue to attack. So maybe knight takes on d4, trying to get some of that material back. Queen up to h8, and it's very difficult for black to win from here. If we come back instead, knight comes down here to b5, queen to b8, and then maybe now we see the knight take here on d4, gobbling up some material here. It's not protected, but then queen takes on b7, gets that pawn back in material. Maybe queen to e7, queen takes here on a6, so white is up material, gives back that material right here. So both sides have a passed pawn, but then we could see queen up here to c8, maybe queen e7 comes back. Queen swings to h8 and starts to attack. It's very difficult to hold on to all this material here. With the king here on f7, it's almost blocking the material that black has to defend this h7 square. And as soon as this h7 square falls, this pawn here on h6, it's going to have a pretty easy path to start marching up the board here. Knight to f3, king f1. Knight comes back here to g5, holding on to this material. Probably the best way I can find that black would still hold on to this material here on h7. Queen over here, c8 potentially. Queen e6, maybe queen to b7, check. This is just one variation that we could come down here. And then white could start marching on the queen side of the board with the pawn. So those are all options that you could see. The best option that the computers came up with as they were analyzing this game was queen to e7. So queen up here to b8, and then queen to e7. Now, it may look very subtle as far as the difference between what the computer said is the optimal move, and that is queen to e7, and the move that was actually played when black went with queen to d7. We'll first look at the queen to e7. After queen h8 attacking this pawn, we see king to e6. This is really the best way for black to hold on to this critical square here on h7. Remember, as soon as this pawn falls, very easy for the pawn to push up here and promote on the h8 square. From here, we could see f4. Now, we'll see this position here in a minute and how it's very different. But if the pawn comes up here to f4, now the knight comes down, takes on d4. If the pawn pushes forward to f5, you can see this is not going to work. Pawn takes here, knight takes, knight recaptures on f5, pawn takes, and then the king takes, and there's no real way for white to continue in this spot. Black should easily be able to even overrun white in this position, has way more pawns, very difficult to attack the king here, can start to bring his queen down and start to attack as much as he wants to. Now let's go back and take a look at the position when instead of king to or queen to e7, we see queen to d7. Very subtle, but now the queen's going to come over here to h8, king to e6, same thing. Now f4, so all these moves are the same. And this is what happened in the game. Knight takes on d4. The main difference is queen to g8. One, this is first check. Now the queen comes over here to f7. Now queen to c8, check. And this is forcing the queen to come over here to d7. Not necessarily the best move. The optimal move, actually, instead of coming to c8, was queen to d8. But lucky for white, we just see the queen come to d7. Queen comes back here, and we repeat the same thing. And then Jan learned from his mistakes and then played queen to d8. Now, why is this so different? Is because now the queen is on d7, whereas before it was on e7. And this is vitally important because now when the pawn comes to f5, the pawn takes here. Now the pawn can take, and after the knight takes, then the queen can take. Now once the king takes up here on d7, then the knight takes here on f5. So these one small differences in the moves from e7 and d7 have very drastic changes in the position that it ended up with. All the commentators are looking at it thinking this is a drawn game. There's no way for white to really break through here unless black makes a mistake. He ended up playing queen to d7, and at the end of that, white ended up with a victory. Played a few more moves here, knight back here to e3, and black decided to resign, realized that he calculated incorrectly. This knight would be able to overwhelm, start to gobble up all this material here, and he would eventually lose. So white takes the victory. Jan gets the win and moves to top place in the tournament. He was the only victory today, so everyone else got the draw, and he was able to now take the sole position in first place going into round number 6. So congratulations to him. It's always nice when you play someone else tied at the top and you get the full point from them. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the tournament and the coverage. We will be back tomorrow for round number 6, but thank you guys so much for watching the coverage.